Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. With the grazing season well underway on many farms, we catch up with Dr Philip Creighton to discuss some key aspects of grazing management. We discuss the current grazing conditions on farms around the country and the impact opening covers has had on grass growth during March. We move on to discuss why it's important we now form grazing groups and the impact that has on both grass and animal performance. Philip outlines the grazing targets and the importance of achieving residuals set for sward for subsequent rotations. We move on to discuss fertiliser application for the second round to meet that rise in demand. We finish up discussing grazing targets on farms for the coming weeks. But we start off with Philip highlighting why our focus now needs to be on our grazing management to maximise lamb performance.
The big thing about grazing over the next couple of weeks now really is that, as you say, lambing on a lot of farms is kind of coming to the end, and for those that have been lambing since early March, we're getting to the position now where lambs are going to soon start to be, taking in, more significant amounts of grass themselves. They'll be hitting that 5 or 6 weeks of age over the next week or two, and we'll be going into the second rotation. So it's about making sure that firstly, I suppose, that we have enough grass there to meet that rising demand. And secondly, it's about managing the grass that it's of as high a quality as possible, considering that we're not only going to be feeding the ewes now, but we're going to be feeding the lambs as well. And we really need high quality grass there to drive on lamb performance.
Look, March has been hit and miss. We got off to a kind of dodgy start to it, so we did weather-wise, but certainly in the latter half of the year, like growth picked up significantly with a couple of warm weeks prior to this week's cold snap. We're seeing some good growth rate figures coming back in from sheep farms on pasture-based, Philip. Like, there's still a variation out there among them, though. But you might give us a bit of insight to what's happening around the country.
Yeah, so definitely, as you say, I suppose late February and early March, we were looking at quite low covers of grass. I suppose growth was behind. We were a little bit worried maybe. I suppose since after Paddy's Day now, weather did improve. Soil temperatures came up quite fast. And for those that were able to get the opportunity to get some fertiliser out maybe in early March, that was really starting to kick in. And the growth rates, I suppose, over the last 2 weeks or so, as you say, granted the temperatures have come down a bit this week, but for the previous 2 weeks, we were seeing average growth rates there for farms that were measuring on pasture base of up around 30 kilos per hectare per day. Now there is a range in that. We're seeing some farms up on 40 or 50 kilos a day, and we're still seeing some farms down at maybe 10 or 15. And I suppose the story that is emerging from that is that the farms that did have a relatively good opening farm cover, so they had a closing plan in place, and they got some fertiliser out relatively early. I suppose everyone was late this year, but they took their opportunities when they could. Their growth rates now are really driving on, versus farms maybe where the opening farm cover was very low. Maybe no closing plan in place. And fair enough, some of this was weather related, some of it was location related. We're not saying that it's all within our control, but certainly it would appear that those that took steps that were within their control are reaping the benefits now, versus maybe people that took their eye off the ball a little bit, are still suffering in terms of growth rates still being quite low, really.
Probably it's still probably higher than most Marches, though, as far as I saved a lot of them farms in terms of growth is kind of nearly matching demand. It's getting them out of that hole that they're in. Yeah,
so the last 2 weeks, I suppose they are definitely people that were in real trouble. The growth rates thankfully have come up a lot, and it's getting people out of trouble. I suppose what I'm saying is that some farms maybe that were still maybe a little bit behind, but had done everything they could, are basically out of trouble now, and are really reaping the benefits of the improved conditions, versus some farms maybe that are still under a fair bit of pressure. And it's important maybe to take stock of where they are, in terms of how much of the farm is grazed. We'd be kind of saying for a flock that was starting to lamb from early March onwards, you're really heading for about 80% of the farm will be grazed at this stage. If people are finding themselves with the entire farm grazed, if the covers were low, ideally they probably should have slowed them up earlier in the rotation and put some supplement in to slow them up. If they're in the position now where they've stripped the whole farm, and look, we are in a cold week now, so growth will be back a bit this week. I suppose they're going to have to assess, maybe do they need to put in supplement now, or that'll depend on what stage they're at in terms of whether they did lamb earlier or whether they've only started lambing later, which maybe suits their farm because they're a later farm anyway.
Just to pull you out a little bit on that point, like the target there of having 60 to 80% of that ground grazed at the moment, that's for the farms are bang on where they should be. I suppose there's probably two scenarios in that. There's the ones that didn't have enough grass, and you alluded to it, they're probably gone through the rotation. And for the others that mightn't even be at that target, that higher covers going through, there's probably one key message for both of them farms, Philip, in terms of grouping up stock and rest of the paddock certainly to get a regrowth, but also being able to get through some of the heavier cover. So maybe if we split both scenarios first, but the grouping up firstly, the benefit of doing that at this stage.
Yeah, and as you say, in both scenarios, it's actually quite important. It's probably even more important for somebody who's actually tight on grass at the moment, in that it gives the chance for as much of the farm as possible to be growing, rather than having a lot of small groups scattered around the farm where everything is being grazed down at the same time. Even with a reduction in temperature this week, I just looked at the temperatures here. We're still at about 8.5 degrees this morning here. Now that has come down from about 11.5 degrees this day last Tuesday. But look, it's still good grass growing soil temperature. It'll depend, I suppose, on what happens through the rest of the week and into the weekend. They are still forecasting colder weather, but I suppose the good thing about this time of year is that the days are longer, and that it's less likely that soil temperatures will drop dramatically versus what you might see in January or February. So that's a positive. But at the same time, we need to be in a position that whatever growth is there, even if it is reduced, that as much of the farm as possible is given the opportunity to take advantage of that and to produce grass and to build covers. That's if you're in a tight situation. If maybe you're not in too bad of a position now at the moment, growth has improved a good bit on your farm, you had good cover starting out. The importance of the grouping up the areas is that, like that as well, we're maximising the regrowths behind us, but we're also starting to think about now closing up for silage, that we can tighten up maybe the grazing area a little bit so that we can prioritise getting some ground closed and growing for silage that we can cut early, mid to late May, to get high quality silage for next winter. So we're already planning, basically 10 or 12 months down the line in terms of what are we going to feed the ewes next winter.
Just the other aspect of grouping up, we've batching up, so you've actually got fields resting, so with the regrowth, that's certainly important for those with low covers of grass, but even for those with higher covers, there's the two benefits there, so Phil. One, they're getting through that higher cover quicker, and you're spending your residency period is shorter, but also you're getting that second rotation, perhaps higher quality regrowth coming back in early, and that's what the lamb's really going to reap the benefit in terms of performance.
Yeah, so I suppose, in terms of if there was higher covers of grass there, while that's very welcome, obviously it's better to have it than to be looking for it. But the issue is there, I suppose, that if we're not able to graze that out properly now, at the end of the first rotation or even the beginning of the second rotation, that's going to have an impact on grass quality for subsequent rotations right up to weaning. Really, the first rotation and the second rotation in terms of graze outs, if we can get that right, really the rest of the grazing management up to weaning will be relatively straightforward. But if we're leaving a lot of stemmy grass behind us now, that will break down, and will continue to grow up through the sward in subsequent rotations, and will make it much more difficult to maintain leaf. And as we say, the lambs, from 4 or 5 weeks of age onwards really are starting to eat grass, and from 6 or 7 weeks on are consuming significant amounts of grass as the milk yield of the ewe starts decreasing, after about 5 weeks. So, we really need to do everything we can to make sure that, those swards are as leafy and as digestible as possible to drive the energy content of the diet for the growing lamb.
So just in terms of that, Philip, like our target post-grazing residual, indeed, or pre-grazing, post-grazing target should be for this stage of the year?
Yeah, so I suppose for the first rotation, really we're saying if we can graze out as tight as possible, so around 3.5 to 4 centimeters of a post-grazing height or a residual, as some people will call it. And then, from your second rotation on, really it'll depend on what your stocking rate is. So if you're highly stocked, we're probably still talking about grazing down to maybe 4 centimeters. If you're more lowly stocked, you can probably go to maybe 4.5 centimeters, rising to about 5 centimeters by the time we get to weaning. And that's really getting the balance between what the supply and demand is. Obviously, the tighter we graze, we will have an impact on individual lamb performance, but there's a trade-off then in terms of if you're very highly stocked, you have more lambs on the farm, so you have to graze that little bit tighter, and you might take a bit of a knock on individual lamb performance, but you have more lambs to sell, versus if you were lowly stocked, that's not what you will be doing. All you're doing there is penalizing a lower number of lambs, to have maybe, perfect grass, but you'll end up with surplus grass very quickly because you're making them work that little bit harder than they need to work.
I suppose, Phil, though, there's the one advantage of the bigger group. You're achieving that residual that bit quicker too. And it might be an issue maybe in some farms. Look at that first couple of weeks of March, conditions weren't ideal. We've seen a lot of underfoot conditions getting bad, pasture getting dirty as well, which is difficult to graze out. There is an opportunity there for farmers to clean that out now in this start of the second rotation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So look, everything being equal in an ideal world, we'd have all that done in the first rotation, but certainly, yes, there was challenging weather conditions there at times. And the right thing to do was to move sheep on. And the last thing we want to be doing is putting them under pressure when we don't need to, particularly in early lactation. The thing to do there now would be that where sheep did have to be moved on quicker, maybe in wet conditions or whatever in the first rotation, try and target those during dry periods now in the second rotation to graze that out, as best as possible. And again, as I said, lambs aren't going to be consuming significant amounts of grass really until they're 6 or 7 weeks old. So there's still time in the second rotation to make the ewes work that little bit harder to set that field up for the third rotation. But at that point, it really needs to be as good as possible because the lambs are going to be consuming a lot of grass at that stage. So ideally, first rotation sets up the second, but if there's times that we had to adjust our management in the first, that's fine, that's normal. Do your best in the second rotation, and that should then leave it right for the third and fourth and fifth rotations.
Just like, and I suppose we'll come to the fertiliser aspect in a moment, but just to finish out the group stuff with you for a moment, like, it's not too early in the season either to be considering temporary fencing, getting our paddock size now to match our group size and maybe minimising the number of grazing groups we have on the farm.
Yeah, so look, the lower the number of groups, that means that there's more of the farm rested and growing at any one time. So from a grass point of view, that's positive. From a sheep point of view, look at it's less groups that need to be herded every day. It's easier to manage them. They're moving on more frequently through different breaks of grass. So, if they're moving every 3 days, they're getting fresh grass much more frequently than if they're only moving every week. So again, that can drive performance. It'll help in terms of maintaining milk yield in the ewes because they're getting a higher quality diet, and it'll also help improve lamb performance because they're getting access to fresher, leafier grass on a much more regular basis as well. And yes, the use of temporary fencing really once lambs are 2 or 3 weeks old, and there's no issue putting up temporary fencing. They're well bonded at that stage. They're not going to be straying too far away, and get them trained up and get them into a rotation at that stage.
Just like I mentioned there, like that second round fertiliser application in a lot of farms, we've seen the first round was a bit delayed. you know, there could be a tendency there with the good growth rates, maybe take a foot off a little bit this stage here, but her demands are still increasing quite rapidly on sheep farms. What's your recommendation, Philip, for the start of April in terms of fertiliser application, maybe just in type or quantities?
Yeah, so I suppose really it's again about getting you know, another 20 to 30 kilos of nitrogen out per hectare. You know, you're kind of 20 to 25 units to the acre again, which is, I suppose, the balance of the same again from the first application really. And yes, you know, first rotation or first applications were delayed on a lot of farms this year due to the weather, and that was the right thing to do, you know, the responsible thing to do. But we are kind of getting to the stage now where a lot of people maybe would have got at least part of the farm spread, you know, about a month ago. And, you know, a lot of that nitrogen will have been used now growing the grass for the first rotation and the start of the second rotation. So as we move through now and as fields have been grazed, they should have been getting topped up again, or should be getting topped up over the next week or two. And that's going to grow the grass really for the third rotation. When again, as we've said, and I know I'm repeating myself, but that's when we're really at a very high demand on sheep farms, because you still have the ewes eating significant amounts of grass every day because they're still lactating, but you also have the lambs taking in significant amounts of grass as well every day. So,
and you will look, really you considering silage as well, like at that stage.
And we need to be considering closing up part of the farm for silage as well. So, you know, our demands are going to keep rising quite rapidly over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So we need to again do everything that we can do to make sure that there's no lull in grass growth to match that demand.
Is there an opportunity, Philip, at the moment to maybe start trickle feeding in some of the compounds where soil fertility needs to be addressed?
Yeah. Second application is an ideal time to start looking at your soil test results, identifying, you know, what fields need what, and it's a good time to be going with a compound to address some of those issues, to maximise performance, I suppose, during April and May. And again, as our demands are increasing, we want to be trying to address anything that we can that will minimise a reduction in grass growth potential of the farm. And if soil fertility is below optimal, then grass growth will be below optimal. So it's the ideal time to start thinking about addressing some of those issues as well.
And look, just in terms of, we mentioned about growth and different things and being on target, like as we're heading towards mid-April, we're still looking at about 20 days grass ahead as grass growth rates pick up. It's perhaps no harm just to assess where we are in terms of cover before people consider closing up.
Yeah, so really, as you say, we're looking at about 20 days ahead of a target at the moment, you know, heading into the middle of April. And usually then what will happen is that we'll reach kind of magic day. We'll reach where, you know, growth is matching demand. And, you know, if we've done all the things we've there discussed in terms of grouping up and getting, you know, your next round of fertiliser out and all that, that growth rate will continue to increase. And what we do there then is to match the increase in growth rate, we increase our demand by closing off a part of the farm for silage, so that we're still keeping our growth rate and our demand in balance, but we also have part of the farm closed and growing to produce our silage requirements. So it's about keeping things in balance. And up to now, what we've been trying to do is keep the daily demand and the daily growth rate in balance as much as possible for the early part. As that now naturally increases on the growth side, we manipulate our management to increase the demand while also allowing us that opportunity to close up.
Phil, let's hope conditions improve. We get a wee bit more milder weather next week, and this cold snap passes and we see growth coming up again. Look, hopefully we get the benefits of that in terms of lamb performance this spring. Phil, it was good catching up with you. Thanks for your insights on grazing management for the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Ciarán.
Okay, we'll have to wrap things up with that. Again, it was very good getting Phil on, just highlighting some of them key targets again for grazing for the coming weeks. And really, it's important we get our rotation set up now. We form our grazing groups, because it will have a big impact on animal performance and indeed in our grassland performance for the rest of the season. It's key that we get started on the right foot. We will start doing our grass reports again. They'll be available along with our updates on the sheep programme on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. That's it for me for this episode. Again, thanks for joining. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in any of our episodes.